Come now, that is too much for these tomatoes.
It is a fair price. But because it is you, we can agree on this.
They said my son was pregnant. That's how it started. A group of boys, maybe 12 or 13, running through the dusty marketplace, pointing and laughing at the boy with the swollen belly. One of them shouted, loud enough for the entire street to hear, "Hey, look, it's the pregnant boy!" And the rest exploded into laughter. Florence stood nearby, holding a woven basket with a few pieces of sweet potatoes she couldn't afford to buy. Her grip tightened, her knuckles whitening as her heart dropped. Her son, Thomas, stood frozen, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. His oversized t-shirt couldn't hide the curve of his bloated stomach, and the humiliation flushed across his face like a slap. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked away. Florence didn't follow him right away. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they had forgotten how to move. All she could do was watch as her son disappeared behind a rusted tin shack trying to outrun their laughter. She knew those boys. Their mothers greeted her every Sunday, but in that moment, they were wolves, and her son was the wounded prey. That night, Thomas didn't speak during dinner. Not that there was much to eat. A little rice, some boiled greens, and silence that hung thick in the room. He sat on the floor, legs folded, head down. He picked at his food but barely ate. His mother sat across from him, her mind racing, her stomach full of worry rather than food. "I'm not pregnant," Thomas whispered finally, without looking up. Florence reached across the woven mat and gently placed her hand on his. "I know, baby. Of course you're not." He pulled his hand away. The first time Florence noticed something was wrong, Thomas was 15. It was the dry season, the heat unbearable, the village quiet under a sky that never seemed to move. Thomas came home from school one afternoon limping, saying his legs hurt. She thought he had tripped or played too hard with the boys. She gave him warm water and rubbed his knees with eucalyptus oil. But the swelling didn't go down, it got worse. Days later, his ankles looked like they were filled with water, then his hands, then his face. And one morning she saw his belly, round, tight, unnatural. She touched it gently and he winced. "We need to go to the clinic," she said. The clinic was small, more like a shed, with peeling paint and one dusty examination table. The nurse looked overworked and disinterested. After a brief glance at Thomas, she frowned and said, "Probably some kind of allergy, or maybe he's eating too much salt. Try steaming some local herbs. He'll be fine." Florence asked if they could run a test. Blood, urine, anything. The nurse shook her head. "We don't have that kind of equipment here, and besides," she added, gesturing toward the other patients waiting outside, "he's not the only one sick." Florence left with Thomas, carrying more fear than answers, and so began the journey. The whispers in the market grew louder. People stopped asking if Thomas was sick. They started assuming. Rumors spread faster than illness, that he had a woman's disease, that it was a curse, that he had swallowed something evil. Even that Florence had performed dark rituals that backfired on her own child. At night, when the world quieted and the air turned cold, Florence lay on her side and watched Thomas try to sleep. He would toss and turn, hands resting on his belly, eyes wide open toward the broken roof above. She thought of his father, gone 2 years now, a construction accident. One moment a calloused hand wiping sweat from his brow, the next a lifeless body wrapped in cloth. He would have known what to do, or at least she could have leaned on him. But now it was just her and a boy with a belly no one could explain. One morning she found Thomas sitting outside before sunrise. The sky was pale pink, the earth still damp with dew. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I heard them again," he said. "Last night, outside our window." Florence didn't ask who. She knew. "They said I was disgusting." Her heart broke in places she didn't know existed. She sat beside him, and for a while they said nothing. The village slowly came to life around them. Roosters crowing, doors creaking open, pots clanging. But in that moment, all Florence could hear was her son's breathing, shallow and unsure. Thomas was not pregnant, but he was carrying something. Something no doctor had yet explained. Something no neighbor had the kindness to try to understand. Something that was slowly taking pieces of him away, his joy, his dignity, his dreams, and it wasn't stopping. Before there were whispers, before swollen ankles and cruel laughter, before doctors and empty promises, there was just Thomas. Just a boy with dust on his knees, grease on his hands, and a laugh that used to echo through the mango trees behind their house. He was curious, always asking questions no one had time to answer. Why do clouds move? How does a car engine breathe? Where does the sun go when it sets? Florence used to smile and wave him off. Ask your father, she'd say. And Thomas would run off in a blur of bare feet and bright eyes. Back then, they lived in a small but steady home. 3 rooms, a corrugated iron roof that clanged when it rained, and a tiny garden out back where Thomas once tried to plant corn without permission. The plants grew in crooked lines, bursting from the soil in a chaotic dance, but he was proud. He called it his farm. Florence let him believe it, even when she had to replant everything later. His father, Matthew, was a tall man with rough hands and a gentle voice. He worked long hours at a nearby construction site, returning home each evening with a weary smile and shoulders lined with dust. But no matter how tired he was, he always found time for Thomas. There was a small transistor radio, broken and forgotten in the corner of their room. One evening, Thomas brought it to his father. "Can we fix it?" he asked. Matthew smiled. "Anything can be fixed if you care enough." They sat together for hours on the front step, Thomas holding the screwdriver, Matthew guiding his hands. They opened the back, examined wires, tested batteries. The radio never did work, but the sound of their laughter that night was music enough. Thomas wanted to be a vehicle engineer, not a driver, not a mechanic, an engineer. He told anyone who'd listen. "One day I'll build my own car, not just fix broken ones." He sketched ideas in his school books, strange machines with long noses and wheels that spun in opposite directions. Most people laughed. Some patted his head. Florence didn't always understand his drawings, but she saved every single one. At school, Thomas was quiet but clever. He liked math, especially when it involved gears, pulleys, and anything that moved. His teacher said he was bright. Florence beamed with pride whenever someone said, "That boy of yours is going somewhere." They didn't have much, but they had enough. Evenings were filled with warmth. Florence would cook millet porridge while Matthew and Thomas repaired broken pots or played games with bottle caps. When the sun dipped low and the chickens settled, the family would sit close, their voices soft against the backdrop of insects chirping outside. It was not a perfect life. The roof leaked in heavy rains. Sometimes they went to bed hungry when wages came late, but there was laughter and love, and the quiet comfort of knowing tomorrow would come. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday. Thomas had just returned from school with dust-covered shoes and a grin that said he'd won a game of soccer. Florence was washing clothes outside, her sleeves wet and her hands wrinkled. Matthew was in the garden, trimming the overgrown hedge that Thomas had neglected since his corn experiment failed. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the air, a sound sharper than thunder, closer than anything she'd ever heard. Florence looked up. The hedge clippers lay on the ground. Matthew wasn't moving. She screamed. Later they told her it was an accident. A piece of scaffolding had fallen at the site where Matthew worked. But Florence never understood how it could happen on his day off. Why he was even there. Why no one came to tell her until it was too late. The days after were a blur of white cloths, whispered prayers, and hands she didn't recognize patting her back. Thomas didn't cry at the funeral. He stood still, staring at the ground, gripping the broken radio they'd never fixed. Florence remembered watching him that night, curled up in the corner of their now too quiet home. The boy who once asked where the sun went was now silent, as if the sun had taken his voice when it disappeared behind the hills. That was the beginning. She didn't notice the swelling at first. Thomas had stopped playing outside. He said he was tired. He stayed in bed longer, ate less, moved slower. Florence thought it was grief, and maybe it was, until one morning he couldn't button his shirt. His belly had begun to rise, not like someone who had eaten too much, but tight, unnatural, a balloon filling from the inside. Florence touched it, confused, then alarmed. Thomas just looked at her and said, "It hurts." And from that moment on, everything changed. It began so quietly that Florence almost didn't notice. At first, Thomas said his legs hurt. He came home from school dragging one foot slightly behind the other, like the ground had become heavier. Florence assumed he'd twisted something playing football, or maybe just overexerted himself in the sun. She boiled herbs, massaged his calves, and wrapped his ankles with warm cloth. But the swelling didn't go away. Within days, his knees puffed up, his toes became sausages, and his skin stretched taut, as if something inside was pushing outward. Florence watched the changes with growing unease. When she asked Thomas how he felt, he only shrugged and said, "It's not that bad. I can still walk." She wanted to believe him. She needed to. A week later, she found him sitting on the porch, staring at his hands. They looked foreign, bloated, red, unrecognizable. He flexed his fingers slowly, wincing as the skin creased. Florence didn't wait any longer. She wrapped a scarf around her head, packed a plastic bag with water and a piece of dried cassava, and helped Thomas into a faded t-shirt that barely fit him now. Together, they made the slow journey to the village clinic, a one-room building made of crumbling bricks and fading blue paint. A handmade sign hung above the door, swinging on a crooked nail, "Hope Health Post." Inside, the air was hot and thick, buzzing with flies. A single nurse sat behind a desk, fanning herself with a folder. A young mother waited in the corner with a coughing toddler, and an elderly man slept on a bench, his legs shaking every few minutes. Florence greeted the nurse softly. "My son is swelling. It started with his legs. Now his hands too." The nurse didn't look up. "Fever?" "No, no fever." "Rash?" "No, only swelling." "Vomiting? Diarrhea?" Florence hesitated. "No." The nurse finally raised her eyes. "Then it's probably water retention or food sensitivity. Has he been eating a lot of salt?" "I don't think so," Florence replied, glancing at Thomas, who stood silently, his arms hanging by his side like they no longer belonged to him. The nurse stood and walked around the desk. She pressed Thomas's belly once, briefly, then stepped back. "It could be an allergy, or maybe something spiritual. It happens sometimes. Try boiling neem leaves and bathing him in it every morning, and cut down on salt." Florence's mouth went dry. "Can we do a test? Blood, maybe? Something deeper?" "We don't have equipment for that here," the nurse replied with finality. "And even if we did, you'd need to pay up front. We had to stop running tests for free. Too many people taking advantage." "I can pay something," Florence said quickly, pulling a small bundle of coins from her pocket. The nurse barely looked. "That won't even cover a glucose strip." She handed Florence a folded piece of paper with handwritten instructions for the herbal bath and dismissed them with a tired nod. Outside, the sun beat down relentlessly. Florence stood for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. Thomas didn't speak. He looked at the paper, then at his mother, then at the dusty road beneath them. "Maybe it's not that serious," he said softly. "Maybe it'll go away." Florence nodded, though her gut told her otherwise. "We'll try the neem." They returned home in silence. That night she boiled the leaves as instructed. The bitter scent filled the house, stinging her eyes. Thomas stood still as she poured the mixture over his body, the steam rising around him like ghostly smoke. But nothing changed. The swelling grew, and then came the belly. It started small, just a tightness above the navel. But within a week, it expanded, firm, round, unnatural. When Florence pressed it gently, Thomas gasped. His breath shortened. He couldn't sleep lying flat anymore. She returned to the clinic, alone this time, holding a small container of urine and the coins she had saved from selling vegetables on the roadside. The nurse didn't recognize her at first. When Florence reminded her, the woman frowned. "You again?" "My son is getting worse. His stomach is—" "I told you," the nurse interrupted. "We can't help you here. If it's that bad, go to the district hospital." Florence blinked. "The one in the city?" The nurse nodded, already turning away. "If you can afford it." The hospital was nearly 60 kilometers away, a 2-hour journey by car, if you had one. Florence didn't even have a bicycle. She left the clinic without a word. That afternoon, Thomas refused to leave the house. He said his classmates stared at him during school, whispering, pointing. One boy had asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Is it a boy or a girl in there?" Florence's face flushed with shame, though it wasn't hers to carry. That night, she lit a candle and sat beside Thomas's mat. He lay on his side, hugging his belly, his breathing shallow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas turned toward the wall. "It's okay, Mama. I know you're trying." But his voice sounded smaller than it used to, as if something inside him was shrinking, even as his body swelled. Florence sat in the darkness long after the candle died, staring at the silhouette of her son. The radio on the shelf stared back at her, broken and silent, and for the first time she wondered if whatever this was, it might not go away. The first time Florence heard the laughter, it sounded like any other child's game, sharp, chaotic, echoing across the village square like bouncing stones. She paused, a basket of vegetables in her arms, and smiled for a moment. Children were always laughing, weren't they? But then she heard it again, louder this time, more pointed. "Pregnant boy! Pregnant boy!" Her breath caught. She turned toward the noise, and there he was, Thomas, walking slowly past a group of younger children, his shoulders hunched, his steps uncertain. His shirt clung to his belly, which had become too large to hide. One little girl ran up beside him, poked his stomach, and squealed with laughter before darting away. Florence dropped the basket. The tomatoes spilled onto the dirt road, rolling under a wooden bench where two women sat, watching. "She should keep him inside," one of them muttered. "It's embarrassing." "Poor child," the other replied, though her tone lacked any warmth. "But you know what they say. It's probably a curse. Maybe something she did." Florence didn't pick up the tomatoes. She just walked, quickly, almost stumbling, until she reached Thomas's side. His face was unreadable. Not anger, not sadness, just blank. "They're just kids," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Thomas didn't respond. That evening when they got home, Thomas went straight to bed without dinner. He curled onto his mat, facing the wall, his arms wrapped protectively around his belly. Florence sat in the kitchen, staring at a pot of untouched porridge, her hands trembling. The gossip didn't stop. Within days, it had spread like wildfire, not just among the children, but the adults too. Women whispered at the water pump. Men made offhand remarks at the roadside bar. Teenagers mimicked the way Thomas walked, exaggerating the sway of his hips and puffing out their stomachs. A neighbor, Mama Ruth, confronted Florence outside the church. "You need to take him to a spiritual leader," she said firmly. "This is not a normal sickness. He's not right. You're bringing shame to this village." Florence tried to explain, tried to say that they had gone to the clinic that they were saving for the hospital in the city, but Mama Ruth only shook her head. "Saving for what? To let him explode in front of us. That child is possessed. You're blind if you don't see it." Florence didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Thomas refused to go to school. "They laugh," he said simply. "I'll talk to your teacher," Florence replied. But when she arrived at the small schoolhouse, the headmaster, a thin man with glasses too big for his face, sighed as soon as she walked in. "Mrs. Florence," he began, "we've noticed some disruption." "Disruption?" "Thomas's presence is creating discomfort among the students. Some of the parents have complained. They say he's distracting the others. His appearance, his condition, it causes confusion." "He's sick," Florence said, her voice cracking. "That's all." The headmaster nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I understand, but perhaps it would be best for everyone if he took a break from school, just until his situation stabilizes." Florence didn't respond. She walked out of the office and didn't look back. At home, she didn't tell Thomas what the headmaster had said. She didn't have to. He could see it in her face. He simply nodded. "Okay." The days became slower after that. Thomas stopped going outside. He stopped drawing. The radio sat untouched in the corner, collecting dust. The house grew quieter, heavier. Florence tried to fill the silence, singing while cooking, sweeping the floor more often than necessary. But the air remained thick with unspoken things. Once she caught him standing by the window, watching the children play outside. One of them, a boy from their compound, spotted him and shouted, "Hide your babies! The pregnant boy is back!" Thomas stepped away before she could reach him. That night she sat on his mat and said, "You know, you're not alone." He didn't answer. Florence placed her hand gently on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "Don't lie to me, Mama," he whispered. "Everyone hates me." No, they don't." He turned to face her. His eyes were wet but clear. "They laugh at me. They stare like I'm a monster. Even the teachers think I shouldn't be around other kids. I'm not stupid. I hear them." Florence's throat burned. She wanted to fight every person in that village. She wanted to scream until the walls shook. But instead, she held her son close and said the only thing she could. "You are not what they say." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if he believed her or if she believed herself. When science failed, people turned to spirit. That's what Mama Ruth said. Florence hadn't believed in that world for a long time, not since she was a child, when her grandmother would sprinkle ash at doorways and mumble prayers to trees. But pain has a way of softening disbelief, and shame even more so. It was after another sleepless night. Thomas had woken gasping, clutching his chest. His belly had become so tight that even breathing seemed like a task too big for his body. Florence sat beside him, wiping sweat from his forehead, whispering comfort that no longer worked. In the morning, Mama Ruth came knocking. "I know someone who can help," she said, arms folded tightly across her chest. "Real help, not like those clinics." Florence hesitated. "A healer? Not just a healer. A man who speaks to what's beyond. If it's a curse, he'll see it. If it's a spirit, he'll cast it out. Your son needs more than herbs and hospitals now." Florence said nothing. That afternoon, she borrowed money from a friend, enough to cover the journey, a few offerings, and maybe some medicine if needed. She wrapped Thomas in a loose robe, covering his swelling as best as she could, and led him toward the hills where the healer lived. The man's compound stood behind a curtain of hanging gourds and rusted bells. Chickens pecked around the dusty yard. A smoky scent clung to the air, part charcoal, part something unplaceable. He wore a long red robe, beads around his neck, and his eyes were pale, clouded but not blind. He barely spoke. He looked at Thomas once, then turned to Florence and said, "The boy is full." "Full of what?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he led them inside a dark room lined with dried herbs, animal bones, and faded cloths that whispered with every breeze. He asked for the boy's name, then his father's name, then her mother's name. Florence answered everything. He told her to sit, to stay quiet, and to wait. The ritual began. First came the smoke, bitter, choking, curling in slow circles around the boy. Then the chanting, low, rhythmic, in a language Florence didn't understand. The healer tied a string around Thomas's wrist, then placed a small black stone on his belly. "Don't move," he instructed. He drew symbols in white chalk on the dirt floor, lit a candle made of animal fat, and when Thomas started to cough, the healer placed both hands on the boy's head and shouted something sharp, something fierce, something that echoed off the walls like thunder. Florence felt dizzy. By the time the ritual ended, her knees were shaking. The healer turned to her. "He is not free yet, but this was the first step." "How many steps?" she asked. He shrugged. "As many as it takes." Then he named his price. It was more than she had. Florence offered what little remained. He took it without hesitation and told her to come back in 3 days, with more. Outside, the sky had darkened. Thomas looked pale, exhausted. He didn't speak the entire walk home. That night, Florence lit a candle at the corner of the room and whispered a prayer, not to any god in particular, but to whatever might be listening. She asked for mercy, for a sign. The next morning, Thomas said he felt lighter. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. He smiled once, ate a little more, sat upright for longer than a few minutes. Florence's heart dared to hope. She returned to the healer 3 days later, selling her last cooking pot to afford the visit. He repeated the ritual, added more smoke, tied another string. This time, he told her that the spirit inside the boy was resisting, that it was strong, but not stronger than him. She believed him. How could she not? But the changes stopped. By the end of the week, Thomas could barely sit up again. The pain returned, sharper. The swelling worsened. He couldn't keep food down. Florence went back to the compound, desperate. "He's worse," she said. The healer frowned, annoyed. "Then you didn't follow the instructions properly. Did you keep the candle burning at night?" I let it go out once." "There, that's it. The spirit is angry. You have to start again." "But I don't have any more money." He looked at her with eyes that were suddenly less cloudy, sharper. "Then there is nothing more I can do." Florence stood there, stunned. She had given everything, her savings, her time, her hope, and now he was sending her away. Outside, the bells clanged in the wind. The gourds knocked gently against each other like mocking laughter. Florence walked back down the hill alone. At home, Thomas didn't ask where she'd gone. He didn't ask anything anymore. She looked at his face, pale, drawn, and then at the strings around his wrists. She untied them slowly, one by one, and dropped them into the fire. The healer had lied. Whatever was wrong with her son, it was not a spirit. It was something real. And it was getting worse. When Florence realized the healer had lied, something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not all at once. It was a quiet fracture, like the slow splitting of dry wood under pressure, invisible at first, but she felt it. She sat awake all night, staring at the low ceiling of their house, counting the holes where moonlight leaked through. Beside her, Thomas wheezed softly in his sleep, his belly rising like a full balloon, stretching his skin until it looked translucent. His arms had grown thinner, his cheeks hollow. He was disappearing under the weight of something no one could name. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would take him to the hospital in the city. She didn't have the money. She didn't know how they would get there. But something told her that if she waited any longer, Thomas might not wake up the next time he closed his eyes. That morning, she sold their house. It wasn't much. A relative of her late husband had always eyed the small plot of land. He gave her a price far below its worth, but Florence didn't argue. She signed the paper, took the money, and used it to hire a man with an old pickup truck to take them to the district hospital. The journey took nearly 4 hours over broken roads. Thomas lay in the back, wrapped in blankets, his eyes closed, lips dry. The truck bounced with every pothole, and each jolt made him wince. Florence kept one hand on his chest the entire ride, to feel the rise and fall, to know he was still breathing. When they reached the hospital gates, she ran inside, calling for help. At first, the receptionist barely looked up. The waiting room was crowded, mothers holding infants, old men leaning on sticks, young girls clutching their sides in pain. It was chaos. Florence tried to explain. Her son was dying. His stomach was swelling. He couldn't breathe. The receptionist pointed to a wooden bench. "Wait your turn. He can't wait," Florence cried. "Please, he's suffocating." A nurse happened to walk by. She paused, glanced toward the door where Thomas was being carried in by the driver. Her eyes widened. Without a word, she called for a gurney. Within seconds, everything changed. Thomas was wheeled through double doors. Florence followed, her heart thudding. Doctors appeared. Questions flew. How long has he been like this? Does he have a fever? Any previous diagnosis? Florence answered as best she could, but most of the time she just shook her head. No one had ever told her what was happening. No tests, no scans, only guesses and smoke and lies. One doctor, a tall man with a scar on his jaw, examined Thomas's belly and ordered an ultrasound. Florence watched the screen as the technician moved the wand across Thomas's skin. It showed waves, dark rippling fluid filling the spaces where organs should be. The doctor pointed. "Ascites," he said. Florence blinked. "What is that?" "It's a buildup of fluid in the abdomen," he explained gently, "usually caused by liver damage, infection, or malnutrition. But in this case, it's severe, very severe." "Can it kill him?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Yes, if untreated." They prepared for immediate drainage. Florence stood in a corner of the sterile room, her hands shaking as nurses laid Thomas flat. A tube was inserted into his side. Slowly, thick yellowish fluid began to fill a plastic container. 1 liter, 2, 3. At 8 liters, the doctor told them to stop. "We can't remove it all at once," he said. "If we do, his body will go into shock." Thomas's face looked different already, less strained. His chest moved more easily. His lips parted and he drew in a deep breath, as if it were his first. Florence covered her mouth and cried, not the loud wailing of grief, but the quiet, breathless sobbing of a woman who had carried fear in her bones for too long. Later, after Thomas was cleaned and resting, she sat by his bedside. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, not in pain, not in panic, but with something close to peace. "I can breathe," he whispered. She smiled through tears. "I know, baby. I know." For the first time in months, she felt something warm in her chest. Hope. It was fragile, delicate as an eggshell, but it was there. The doctor told her they would need to monitor him closely. The fluid would return. He would need more procedures, tests, medications. A long road lay ahead, but Florence wasn't afraid of roads anymore. She had walked through fire. She had carried her child through storms of laughter, of judgment, of silence. And now, finally, someone had spoken the truth. His name was Thomas. He was not possessed. He was not cursed. He was not the pregnant boy. He was just sick. And now, maybe, just maybe, he could get better. For 3 days, Florence lived inside a fragile bubble of hope. Thomas could breathe again. He sat up without pain, spoke in full sentences, even asked for porridge. His skin looked less stretched, his face less sunken. When she brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead, he didn't flinch. He smiled. She wanted to believe the worst was behind them. But on the 4th day, she noticed the way he sat with his arms crossed over his belly again. How his breathing slowed. How when he reached for a glass of water, his hand trembled. The doctor had warned her. The fluid will return, he had said. We'll need to drain it again, possibly every 2 to 3 weeks. Florence hadn't fully understood what that meant. Not until she saw Thomas's belly beginning to rise again, not as sharply as before, but enough to make her chest tighten with dread. She asked the nurse what to do. Bring him back as soon as possible, the nurse replied, glancing at a clipboard. You'll need to schedule the next paracentesis, and make sure to pay the procedure fee in full before the appointment. Florence nodded, though her stomach twisted. The hospital gave them 5 days of medicine and released Thomas with a handwritten slip. Return for fluid drainage, 16th. The slip didn't come with transportation, or food, or a way to pay for the next procedure. Florence calculated everything she had left. What remained after selling the house, after paying the hospital, after buying medicine and food? Enough for maybe 2 weeks of survival, if she skipped her own meals. So she skipped. She stopped eating more than once a day. Some days she didn't eat at all. She began digging for neighbors, manual labor that tore at her joints and left her hands raw, all for a single $1 a day. That dollar had to stretch, rent for the shack they now lived in, porridge for Thomas, occasional soap or oil. There was nothing extra, nothing for the hospital. On the 16th, she returned anyway. She carried Thomas's medical slip in a small plastic bag with the coins she'd saved. When the cashier counted it, she didn't raise her eyes. This isn't enough. Florence swallowed hard. It's all I have. You'll need to wait until we have clearance from administration. How long will that take? The woman shrugged. A few hours, maybe all day. Florence turned to Thomas, who was seated on a bench outside, leaning forward, his breath shallow again. We'll wait, she whispered. They waited and waited. 7 hours passed. By sunset, a nurse finally approached and said, "The doctor can see him now." Thomas was pale. Sweat glistened on his forehead. But he stood. This time, only 4 liters were drained. The doctor explained that removing too much fluid at once could be dangerous, especially if the body hadn't fully stabilized. Thomas lay silently afterward, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. When Florence asked if he was okay, he nodded, but didn't speak. On the way home, they rode a crowded bus packed with strangers who stared too long at Thomas's swollen belly. One woman whispered to another, then laughed. Florence clenched her jaw, holding Thomas's hand tighter. When they arrived at the new shack they rented, just 2 walls and a roof patched with plastic, Florence laid Thomas down and sat beside him. He finally spoke. "I don't think I'm getting better," he said quietly. Florence's throat tightened. "The doctors are helping. They just take the water out, then it comes back. Over and over." His voice cracked. "What if it never stops?" Florence didn't have an answer. Later that night, she lit a candle and sat alone, watching the flame flicker. The air was damp and heavy, and outside dogs barked in the distance. She thought of the doctor's voice, of the nurse's indifference, of the line of patients in the hospital hallway, each waiting with hollow eyes and thin arms. She thought of the nurse who walked past them without a glance, the guard who told her, "You can't sit here unless you're paying." In a place full of the sick, Thomas was still invisible. He was still the boy no one believed. Even now, with a diagnosis, with real procedures, he was no closer to healing. They were only buying time, days, maybe weeks. But how long could she keep buying? The coins in her bag made a soft clink when she counted them again. Not enough for another drainage. Not enough for another bus ride. Not enough for anything. She leaned her head against the cold wall and whispered a prayer, not to spirits, not to healers, not even to God, but to the thin thread of faith she still carried somewhere deep inside. Let him make it. Just 1 more month. Just until I can find more work. Just until someone helps us. When she looked over at Thomas, he was asleep. One hand rested on his belly. The other clutched the broken radio. The night Thomas died was not unlike any other. The air was still. The moon hung low, hiding behind a thick veil of clouds. The small shack Florence and her son now called home creaked with each breath of wind. There was no storm, no lightning, no dramatic warning, just silence. Florence had spent the day working in someone's field, digging soil until her palms blistered. She came home with only enough money for flour and a few onions. Thomas hadn't eaten much. His belly was swelling again. He said little, just held his side and lay curled on the mat. She cooked quietly. The usual, porridge and boiled water. They didn't talk during dinner, not because of anger, but because words had started to feel like luxuries. When it was time to sleep, Florence sat next to Thomas and massaged his legs. His ankles were swelling again. His skin felt hot. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. "Mama," he whispered, as she pulled the thin sheet over him. "If something happens, don't be afraid." She looked at him. "Nothing is going to happen, Thomas." He didn't answer. Florence lay down beside him, back to back, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Slow, shallow, but steady. Then, sometime past midnight, that rhythm stopped. At first she thought she had imagined it. The night was quiet, too quiet. She turned gently toward him. His chest wasn't moving. She sat up, blinking in the darkness. "Thomas?" No response. She leaned closer. "Thomas?" Still nothing. She reached out and touched his face. It was cold. "Thomas," she shook him. Nothing. Panic rose in her chest like a tidal wave. Her hands began to tremble. Her voice cracked into a scream. "Thomas!" She grabbed his shoulders and shook him harder. His body was limp like a doll. His lips had turned pale. His eyelids fluttered once, and then stilled. Florence screamed so loud that the chickens outside startled. She didn't know what to do. She ran outside barefoot, banging on the neighbor's door. "Help me! He's not breathing, please!" No one answered. The houses were dark. She ran to the next one, then the next. No one opened. In that moment, under the blanket of the indifferent night, Florence realized the truth. They were alone, entirely, devastatingly alone. She stumbled back inside. Her knees hit the floor. She tried to lift him, to turn him on his side, to open his mouth, to do something, anything. But he was still. "I can't lose you," she cried, pressing her forehead to his. "God, no, please, no!" She felt herself slipping into a place darker than grief. A hollow space where time doesn't move and sound doesn't exist. This was it, after everything. After the hospitals, the digging, the prayers, the needles, the begging. After surviving the laughter, the silence, the healer, the bureaucracy. This was it? Then, a sound, so faint she almost thought it was the wind. Then again, a gasp. Thomas's body jerked slightly, his lips parted, his eyes fluttered, unfocused. Florence froze. "Thomas?" Another breath, weak, shallow, but real. She pressed her ear to his chest, a heartbeat, faint, but there. He coughed. Tears spilled down her cheeks as if her body had been saving them for this exact moment. "You're here," she whispered. "You're still here." Thomas blinked slowly. "I dreamed I was flying." Florence laughed through her sobs. "You scared me to death." He smiled, barely. "Sorry, Mama." She cradled him in her arms for what felt like hours, rocked him like he was a baby again. His breath against her skin was the most precious sound she had ever heard. When the sun finally rose, the shack was bathed in a golden light. Outside, the world had already moved on. Birds chirped. Smoke curled from distant fires. Children chased each other through the dust. But inside, Florence sat on the floor, her son asleep against her chest, alive. Alive. She hadn't lost him, not yet. But the fear had changed shape. It was no longer sharp and sudden. It had become constant, slow-burning, a reminder that the line between life and death was thinner than a whisper. Every breath Thomas took now felt like a borrowed one. And Florence knew, if she didn't find help, real help, lasting help, she would lose him for real. And next time, he might not come back. After the night Thomas stopped breathing, something shifted. Not just in Florence, not just in him, but in the very air they breathed, the way time passed inside the shack, the way the sun moved across the floor in the morning. Everything felt slower, heavy, fragile. Florence couldn't stop watching him. Every rise and fall of his chest became a silent prayer. She would sit for hours, pretending to peel cassava or patch torn clothes, all the while stealing glances, counting seconds between breaths, checking the color of his lips, listening for even the softest wheeze. She barely slept. She barely ate. And something in her had cracked for good this time. Not the same sharp break as before, not a single event, but a slow erosion. A constant, aching weight that sat in her bones and refused to leave. The neighbors had heard her scream that night, of course, but none came. Not one knock, not even the next day. No one asked if Thomas had survived. No one asked if she was okay. They had decided, long ago, to stop seeing her. In the following days, Thomas spoke even less than usual. He didn't ask to go outside. He didn't ask what time it was or what day. He didn't even ask for food. Florence tried to coax him. "You should sit outside," she said once. "It's sunny." He shook his head. "I can bring your books if you want to draw." He said nothing. Then one afternoon she came home from digging and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, dust covering his shirt, hands deep inside the corner where they kept old things, torn bags, rusted utensils, bits of wire and forgotten parts. "What are you doing?" she asked gently. He didn't look up, looking for something. She sat beside him, letting the silence settle between them. Finally, he pulled it out, the old radio, the one his father had tried to fix with him years ago, back when the world still made sense. Thomas brushed the dust from its surface with his sleeve. The dial was missing. One of the wires hung loose. The battery panel had rusted through. "It still doesn't work," he muttered. Florence watched as he turned it over in his hands gently, like it was something alive. He opened the back, poked at the wires, then closed it again. He placed it on the floor beside his mat where he could see it. She wanted to say something comforting, maybe even hopeful, but nothing came. That night, as Thomas lay on his side, eyes open, Florence asked, "Do you remember when you and Papa tried to fix that?" He nodded. "He said we could make anything work," Thomas whispered. "If we cared enough." Florence smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Your father believed in a lot of things." Thomas turned the radio gently so it faced him. "I don't think I believe in anything anymore," he said. Florence felt that sentence like a slap. But she didn't react. She only reached over and touched his shoulder. "You're still here," she said. "That means something." He didn't respond. Over the next few days, Thomas spent hours just sitting with the radio. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't take it apart. He just looked at it, like it held memories only he could hear. Florence watched from the doorway, heart heavy. He looked like a boy waiting for a message that would never come. One morning, she found a page torn from his old school notebook. A drawing, a sketch of the radio, carefully outlined, labeled. Underneath, in small, crooked handwriting, he had written, "Maybe someday it will speak again." Florence folded the page and placed it in her shirt pocket, close to her heart. Later that week, while washing clothes outside, she caught a glimpse of herself in a tin bowl filled with water. She barely recognized the woman staring back, sunken cheeks, eyes ringed with exhaustion, lips cracked from sun and silence. She had become hollow, too, just like him. That evening, she asked Thomas, "If you could have anything right now, just one thing, what would it be?" He didn't think long. "Peace." She nodded. "For your body?" He shook his head. "For my mind." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. Florence lay awake that night long after Thomas fell asleep, staring at the shadows on the wall, listening to the wind brush against the tin roof. She wished, more than anything, that the radio would turn on, that a voice would emerge from it. His father's voice, maybe, or music, or even static. Anything to remind them that the world outside still existed. That time hadn't stopped for them, but it stayed silent, just like everything else. The idea came to Thomas one morning quietly, as most of his thoughts did these days. Florence had just returned from the market with half a bag of maize flour and a bruised mango someone had given her out of pity. Thomas sat by the window, the old radio in his lap, sunlight slicing through the wooden slats of their wall. He watched two chickens pecking at the dirt outside, a mother hen and her chicks, bobbing their heads with perfect rhythm. "Maybe we should get some," he said. Florence looked up from the pot. "Chickens," he nodded. "Just 2, maybe 3. I could take care of them." Florence smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd have to build a coop, feed them, clean up after them." Thomas straightened a little. "I can design it, like a real engineer. I'll draw the plan first." There it was again, that flicker, that spark she hadn't seen in weeks. A child's dream stitched together with scraps of logic and wonder. Florence didn't stop him. "All right," she said, "draw your coop." He spent the afternoon hunched over a piece of cardboard torn from an old maize box, sketching shapes and scribbling notes in small, uneven letters. There were tiny windows for ventilation, a slanted roof to let rain slide off, and a feeding system made from recycled bottles. He even included a mechanism, a series of pulleys and levers made from string and sticks, that would open the coop door each morning so they can come out on their own. Florence watched him, heart full and aching. They didn't have money for chickens. Not really. But the next morning she walked 3 kilometers to a roadside market where a woman was selling hens out of a wooden crate. "How much for the small ones?" Florence asked. The woman pointed. "Those? $5 each." Florence opened her palm. 4 coins, a total of $10, saved over weeks, intended for medicine. She handed them over. When she came home with 2 skinny hens and a baby chick, Thomas beamed. He named them. The hens were Rocket and Feather. The chick was called Lucky. He built the coop with scrap wood and nails he found near the roadside. It was crooked and barely stood upright, but to him, it was an engineering marvel. For the first time in a long while, Thomas rose before sunrise to feed them. He spoke to them softly, told them stories, explained how eggs were formed and how to recognize which hen would lay first. Florence stood at a distance and watched. There was something magical in how he carried himself, not as a sick boy with a swollen belly, but as a farmer, a dreamer, someone planning for a tomorrow. Then came the fever. It hit hard and fast. One evening, Thomas said he felt cold. By midnight, he was burning. His body shook with chills, and he moaned in his sleep. His belly had swollen again, worse than ever. Florence touched his forehead and pulled her hand back like it had touched fire. She didn't hesitate. She ran outside barefoot to the neighbor who had a bicycle. "Please," she begged, "I'll pay you later. My son needs to get to the hospital." The man hesitated, then nodded. They arrived at the hospital just after dawn. The nurse remembered them. She took one look and rushed to get the doctor. Thomas needed emergency drainage again, and medicine. More medicine than Florence could afford. She did the only thing she could. She sold the chickens, all of them, Rocket, Feather, and Lucky. The man who bought them didn't ask questions. He counted the money slowly, as if it weighed more than coins. Florence stood there, hands empty, eyes blank. When she returned to the hospital, the doctor was waiting. "We started the procedure," he said. "He's stable now." She walked into the room. Thomas was lying still, his arm hooked up to a bag of fluid. His eyes were closed, but he opened them slowly when he heard her. "You came back," he said, his voice thin. "Of course I did." He looked around. "Where's Rocket?" Florence hesitated. "With a friend." He smiled faintly. "They'll take good care of her." There was no anger in his voice, no disappointment, just quiet understanding. Later that night, as he lay on his side, he whispered, "Maybe next time." Florence turned toward him. "What?" "The next time I'm stronger, maybe we can get more chickens." She didn't answer. She just reached out and held his hand. She didn't have the heart to tell him that next time felt further away than ever. But in that moment, with his fingers wrapped loosely around hers, she let him believe it. Because sometimes the only thing stronger than truth is a child's hope. Florence had never been on the radio. She had never spoken into a microphone. She had never asked for help from strangers. But one morning, with blisters on her feet and dust in her lungs, she did all of those things. It started when she overheard a conversation in the market. 2 women were whispering near a tomato stall, talking about a girl who had received medical treatment after her story went viral online. A local journalist had filmed her, posted her video on the internet, and now people from far away, other countries even, had sent donations. Florence listened in silence, clutching a handful of wilted greens. Her heart thudded in her chest. Later that day, she asked a vendor if he knew where to find someone like that, someone who recorded stories, someone with a camera. The vendor shrugged, then pointed toward a small radio station on the edge of the village. It was a one-room building with a bent antenna and flaking paint. She stood outside for a long time, rehearsing words in her head. When she finally walked in, her voice was shaking. "My name is Florence," she said to the man at the front desk. "My son is sick. He's dying, and no one cares. I need someone to listen." The man looked up. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a t-shirt that read Max Local Radio. He paused, then gestured toward a chair. "Tell me," he said. Florence spoke. She told him everything, from the first swelling to the laughter in the street, from the healer who took her money to the hospital that drained her son like he was a bucket of rainwater. She told him about the chickens, about the nights without food, about the time she thought he had died in her arms. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't tremble. She had no more energy left for tears. When she finished, the man was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me bring my camera." 2 days later, he came to the shack. He filmed Thomas, who sat quietly beside the window, holding the broken radio. He asked if Thomas wanted to say anything. Thomas looked into the camera, eyes tired but clear. "I just want to live," he said. "I want to go back to school. I want to play football. I want to fix radios. I want to raise chickens again." The man nodded. "That's enough." Florence didn't know what would happen next. She didn't expect anything. She just felt like she had done what she could. A week passed. Then one morning, a neighbor who hadn't spoken to her in months stopped her near the well. "I saw your son's video," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it was that bad." Florence blinked. "What video?" The woman showed her on her phone. There it was. Thomas's face, his swollen belly, the shack they lived in, her voice narrating their story. The title read, "They said my son was pregnant. This is what really happened." The video had thousands of views. Comments flooded in. "This broke my heart. Is there a way to help? No child should suffer like this. How do I donate?" Florence didn't understand it all, but when the man from the radio returned and handed her a small envelope with cash inside, she knew something had changed. "This is from a woman in Canada," he said. "She sent it for Thomas. More might come. Just wait." That evening, Florence bought real food: rice, beans, a piece of meat. When she placed the plate in front of Thomas, he blinked. "Meat?" he asked. She nodded. He picked up the fork slowly, as if unsure it was real. He took a bite, then another. Florence sat across from him, watching. After dinner, they sat in silence. Then Thomas said, "You found a way, Mama." Florence didn't answer, but her lips trembled into a smile. He turned the radio in his lap and whispered, "Maybe one day I can fix this and tell stories like mine." She looked at him, this boy who had survived ridicule, silence, hunger, and near death, and realized something. He hadn't just survived. He had endured. And now, for the first time in a long time, the world had heard him. The first email came 2 weeks after the video went online. Florence didn't have an email, of course. But the young man from the radio station, who had now taken it upon himself to check updates for her daily, called her in with wide eyes. "You have to hear this," he said. He read aloud from the screen. "Dear Florence, my name is Dr. Karen Ellis. I am a hepatologist based in Chicago. I recently watched the video about your son Thomas. His case deeply moved me, not only because of his strength, but because I believe I know what he is suffering from. From the visual signs in the video and the symptoms you described, it seems your son may be suffering from a chronic liver disease that is causing severe ascites. With the right diagnostics, imaging, blood tests, and liver function analysis, his condition could be managed much more effectively. The earlier this is caught, the better the outcomes. Please know, this should have been addressed years ago. I'm so sorry no one helped you sooner." Florence said nothing for a long time. She didn't know what a hepatologist was. She didn't fully understand how someone from a place called Chicago could care about her son. But she did understand this. This should have been addressed years ago. That line echoed in her mind like a drum. The young man showed her pictures of other children, before and after treatment, children with swollen bellies just like Thomas. But in the after photos, they were laughing, running. Some were even playing football. "They did something called a liver scan," the man explained. "They gave them medicine to reduce the swelling. Some needed surgery, but they all had care, structured care, in time." Florence blinked slowly. "You mean this could have been stopped?" He nodded. "If someone had helped when he was 15 or 16, even last year." Florence looked down at her hands. So many times she had walked into a clinic and been told to wait. So many doctors who barely looked up. So many excuses. "We don't have the machine. Come back next week. You need a referral. Pay first." She remembered selling her house, selling her chickens, giving a man money to burn herbs and chant spirits, and all this time, the disease had a name and a path and a plan. Florence didn't cry. She just felt tired, as if the weight of this knowledge was heavier than all the burdens she'd carried before. Thomas was seated outside when she returned home. The sun bathed him in warm gold, and he was sketching again. This time, a new idea for a water filtration system using old plastic bottles. She sat beside him and placed her hand gently on his. "Thomas," she said softly, "they found someone, a real doctor, from far away." He looked up. "They said your illness, it has a name, ascites, caused by something in your liver, but it can be managed, maybe even improved." Thomas stared at her, not with excitement, but with something else, something slower, wiser. "How long have we known?" he asked. She hesitated. "Only now." He nodded once. "Too late?" Florence didn't answer. He looked back down at his drawing. "Even if it's too late, maybe it'll help someone else." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "If people know what it is, maybe the next boy with a big belly won't be called pregnant or cursed. Maybe someone will help him." She stared at her son, stunned by his clarity. Later that evening, she sat alone beside the radio, the same one he still kept by his mat. She thought about all the places in the world where children had access to doctors, to scans, to second opinions, where a swollen belly didn't become a rumor, but a reason to act. In her village, no one had even said the word ascites. No one had explained the liver. No one had tried to understand. They had just looked, judged, laughed, walked away. Florence wasn't angry, but she was grieving not just for the years they had lost, but for the possibility that never arrived. The next day, she wrote back, with help. She told Dr. Ellis everything, about the time they drained 8 liters, about the healer, about the hospital that helped, but too late, about the chickens, about the dreams, about the way Thomas whispered, "Maybe next time." And she ended the message with one sentence, "Please tell me if there's still time." The message arrived on a Sunday morning. Florence and Thomas were outside, watching the neighborhood children play with a worn-out ball. Thomas leaned against the wall, his knees tucked under his blanket. His breathing was steady, but his energy low. He hadn't drawn anything in 2 days. The young man from the radio, Prince, they now called him by name, came running through the dusty path, waving his phone in the air. "Florence, it's her, the doctor," she wrote back. Florence stood slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt. Prince stopped in front of her, catching his breath. "Listen to this," he said, opening the email. "Dear Florence, thank you for writing back. Yes, there is still time, but we must act quickly. I have spoken with a medical center in the capital. They are willing to receive Thomas for a full evaluation, liver scan, blood work, and initial stabilization treatment. I will personally cover all medical expenses, transportation, and accommodation. Please tell me when you are ready. With hope, Dr. Karen Ellis." Florence didn't say a word. Her eyes didn't blink. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Thomas looked up from where he sat. "Mama?" She turned toward him slowly. "The doctor," she said. She's helping us." He furrowed his brow. "What kind of help?" Florence knelt down in front of him, her hands shaking as she held his. "She's sending us to the capital, to the big hospital. Everything will be paid for. Tests, treatment, all of it." Thomas stared at her, searching her face for a trace of doubt. Then slowly he whispered, "Like real doctors?" She nodded. "Yes, real doctors, real machines, real help." He didn't smile, not yet, but something lit behind his eyes. A flicker, a breath of belief. "When?" he asked. "As soon as we say yes." For the next 2 days, Florence prepared with the nervous energy of someone entering a new world. She packed their few belongings into a plastic bag, 2 shirts, 1 pair of shoes, a sweater, and a cloth-wrapped pouch of dried maize. Prince helped arrange the bus tickets. Dr. Ellis's team sent confirmation numbers and instructions. Florence stared at the printed paper like it was a letter from the stars. The morning they left, the sun hadn't yet risen. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt. It hung loose on his shoulders. He carried the radio, of course, and the notebook with his sketches. Florence held his hand all the way to the bus stop. The vehicle was old, metal groaning under its own weight, but it moved. Each mile it carried them felt like a tear breaking away from a long, dry wall. They sat in silence for most of the ride. The countryside passed them by in slow waves, fields of maize, rusting rooftops, women walking with baskets balanced on their heads. Life, still happening, still moving. After 7 hours, the city rose ahead like a dream. Tall buildings, paved roads, people in suits, noise that hummed through the air like electricity. Thomas pressed his face to the window. "It's big," he whispered. Florence nodded, nervous. When they arrived at the hospital, a nurse met them at the gate, holding a clipboard, smiling gently. "You must be Thomas," she said. He nodded shyly. "This way." The halls were wide, clean, filled with the scent of sanitizer and the quiet shuffle of real shoes on tile. No lines, no shouting, no people crammed on benches for hours. Florence felt like she had walked into another planet. Thomas was taken for blood tests first, then an ultrasound, then more exams she didn't understand. But the doctors explained everything. They spoke to her with respect. They let her ask questions. They touched Thomas like he mattered. Hours passed, but they didn't feel long. At the end of the day, a doctor sat down with her in a private room. "His condition is advanced," he said gently, "but not hopeless." Florence's heart froze. He can get better? With proper treatment, yes, it will take time, and we can't promise miracles, but there's a chance, a real one. She covered her mouth with both hands. "I thought," she whispered, "I thought it was too late." The doctor shook his head. "It's late, but not too late." That night, Thomas was admitted for monitoring. He was given warm food, clean sheets, and a bed that didn't touch the floor. Florence sat beside him, barely believing the day had happened. As Thomas drifted to sleep, he turned toward her. "Mama?" "Yes?" He hesitated, then, "Maybe next time is now." She blinked. "What?" "That thing I always say, maybe next time. Maybe this is it." She smiled through tears. "Maybe it is." Outside the window, the city glowed. Cars moved like stars on the ground. Somewhere far away, Dr. Ellis was probably sitting in her office, drinking coffee, reading emails. And in a small hospital room lit by hope, a boy named Thomas slept peacefully, for the first time in years. Healing doesn't come like thunder. It doesn't arrive in a bright flash or a single moment of transformation. It comes in whispers, in small changes, in breath that feels just a little easier than the day before. For Thomas, healing began with a bed, a real bed, soft, raised off the ground with clean white sheets and a pillow that didn't smell of dust. The first night in the hospital, he slept nearly 12 hours. When he woke up, he whispered, "I forgot what it feels like to rest." Florence sat beside him the whole time. She didn't sleep, not really, but she watched the way his chest moved slowly, evenly, watched his fingers twitch gently in his dreams, watched the lines on his face slowly begin to smooth out. The doctors drained him again on the second day. 5 liters this time. They explained everything before they began, showed him the instruments, told him what it would feel like. There was no rush, no shouting, no hidden fees. Afterward, Thomas sat up in bed and looked down at his belly. "It's smaller," he said, almost surprised. Florence smiled. "It's working." He touched his ribs. "I can feel them again." Later that day, he was able to walk across the room with help. The nurse clapped quietly when he reached the window. "You've got a strong heart," she said. He grinned. On the 3rd day, they brought him broth and rice, not porridge, real rice. He ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the first time he'd ever tasted food. "This," he said between spoonfuls, "is amazing." Florence laughed. She hadn't heard that sound in so long, it startled her. "You're becoming a city boy now." "No," he said quickly. "Just a boy, like before." Each day brought new, small victories. He sat longer, he stood straighter. He even sketched again, this time a drawing of the hospital room, complete with the IV pole and the nurse's smiling face. But it wasn't all easy. Healing is slow. Some mornings he woke up in pain. Some days his belly felt tight again. Some nights he cried quietly into the pillow because he missed home, or because he was scared the sickness would come back stronger. Florence stayed close. She helped him bathe, helped him walk, read signs with him on the hospital walls. The two of them had never spent this much time together in peace. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but good. One evening, Thomas turned to her as she folded his blanket. "You're not tired?" "Always tired," she smiled, "but not tired of this." He paused. "You think it'll last?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but it's better than it was." He looked at her. It's more than I ever thought I'd have. They shared the room with another patient, a boy named Joseph, 14, who had a heart condition. His mother, Ruth, sat across from Florence, and the two women began to speak each night as their sons slept. Ruth told her stories about the city, about doctors, about how long they had been waiting for surgery. You're lucky, Ruth said one night. Most people die before they get a sponsor. Florence looked at Thomas, who was snoring softly. I know, she whispered. Every minute feels borrowed. Ruth nodded. Maybe that's why it feels more precious. They talked about food, about digging, about chickens. Florence told her about Rocket, Feather, and Lucky, about how she sold them, about Thomas's dream of building a coop. You'll get new ones, Ruth said. When he's stronger. Florence smiled. Maybe. By the end of the week, Thomas had gained 2 kilograms. His blood work showed improvement. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Doctor, Ellis sent updates every few days from Chicago. Progress looks good, one email read. Stay strong, both of you. Healing is slow, but it comes. Florence printed that last line and taped it to the wall above Thomas's bed. Healing is slow, but it comes. On the 10th day, Thomas asked, Do you think one day I could help people like me? You already are, Florence replied. No, I mean, really help. Fix machines, build clinics, teach mothers what to look for, so they don't wait too long. Florence touched his cheek. Then you'll do it, I know you will. He smiled, not the small, shy smile he used when pretending to be brave, a real one, full and wide. That night, as he drifted to sleep, he whispered, This is what hope feels like. Florence sat by his side, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, and for the first time in a long, long time, she let herself believe it too. Thomas had never written a letter before, not a real one. He had scribbled things in notebooks, drawn imaginary machines, mapped chicken coops, but a letter to the world? That was something new. It started with a pen Florence brought him, blue ink, half full, the kind that skips if you press too hard. She handed it to him after breakfast one morning, along with a clean sheet of paper from the nurse's station. Thomas looked at it for a long time. What should I write? He asked. Whatever is in your heart, Florence said. He nodded, and then he began. Dear world, my name is Thomas. I am 18 years old. For a long time, I thought I was the only one, the only boy with a belly that hurt to carry, the only boy people laughed at, the only boy they said was pregnant. But now I know I was never alone. There are children everywhere like me, boys and girls with sicknesses that have names no one ever told them. We are not cursed. We are not monsters. We are just waiting for someone to see us, waiting for someone to say, I believe you. I almost didn't make it. There were days I didn't want to wake up, but I did, because of my mother, because of a radio, because of one person far away who said, let's help him. So I'm writing this letter to say thank you to every person who watched my story, to everyone who donated, to everyone who sent prayers or shared the video or even just said my name out loud with kindness. You didn't just help me. You showed me that I matter, that poor boys from forgotten villages can still dream. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I still have pain. I still have fear. But now I also have hope. So to anyone out there who is hurting or scared or being laughed at, please wait a little longer. Help is real. People are real. And maybe, just maybe, your story is about to begin. With love, Thomas. Florence read the letter 3 times, each time slower than the last. Then Prince came to visit. He brought his camera. We'll film it, he said. Just your voice, just your words, nothing fancy. Thomas sat by the hospital window. The radio was on the table beside him. His notebook was in his lap. He held the letter with both hands. The camera began rolling. His voice was steady, soft at first, then clearer with each sentence. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He just spoke, as if to a friend sitting across from him. When he finished reading, there was silence. Even Prince wiped his eyes. It's perfect, he said. They uploaded the video that evening. The title read, A Letter to the World, from Thomas. It spread faster than the first. People commented from all over the globe. He speaks with so much wisdom. I cried watching this. How can we help more children like him? Thomas, you are not alone. We hear you. Florence sat beside Thomas as they read each one together. Some they didn't understand, written in French and Spanish in languages they had never heard. But the tone was always the same. Kindness, recognition, a kind of distant embrace. One message came from a school in the United States. Dear Thomas, our entire class watched your video. You inspired us to raise funds for children in rural areas with medical conditions. We are naming our school project after you. The Thomas Project. Because everyone deserves to be seen. Thank you for teaching us what courage looks like. Thomas didn't say much after reading that. But Florence saw it in his face, that flicker again. The one that said, I am more than my pain. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he whispered, Mama? Yes? If I don't get better, I think I'll still be okay. Florence sat up. What do you mean? I mean, I used to think the only way to live was to be healed. But now, I think maybe the way you live is how you help. She reached over and held his hand. You're already helping, she said, just by being you. Thomas looked at the ceiling. I want to write more. Not just about me, about kids like Joseph, about others. You will, she said. You think I could work at a radio station one day? Florence smiled. I think you could run one. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, the boy with the broken body and the unbreakable heart had written to the world, and the world had written back. It happened quietly. No screams, no sirens, no final words. Just a soft gasp in the middle of the night. Florence had dozed off in the chair beside Thomas's bed, her head tilted to the side, the pages of his last drawing still in her lap. She woke to the sound of his breath catching. Not a cry, not a choke, just a stillness where life used to be. Her eyes flew open. Thomas was pale, his lips were dry, his eyes half open, staring into something she couldn't see. Thomas, she whispered. He blinked, slowly, then again, then stopped. The nurses rushed in. The machines beeped. A doctor shouted something about oxygen. Hands moved fast, tubes adjusted, wires checked. Florence stood frozen in the corner, watching them try to bring her son back, again. But this time, it felt different. The air felt too heavy, the light in the room too sharp, and in that moment, time split. Thomas was not in the bed. He was somewhere else, someplace warm, someplace quiet. He stood in a wide field, golden and endless. The grass tickled his bare feet. The sky above was soft and full of motion, clouds moving slowly like stories written in air. He looked down at himself. His belly was gone. He was standing tall, light as wind, and behind him he felt something shift. He turned. Wings. Not giant, not glowing, just quiet, soft wings. The kind that belong to those who have carried more than most. Worn at the edges. Real. He flexed them gently. He didn't fly. Not yet. But he knew he could. Then he heard her voice. Mama, he whispered. He turned again, and there she was, sitting on a bench in the field, sewing something, her fingers nimble like they used to be. Her eyes focused. She didn't look tired. He walked toward her. Are you real? He asked. She looked up and smiled. Are you? He laughed. The sound was full. He sat beside her. Is this it? He asked. I don't know, she said. Maybe it's just a place for resting. He nodded. I'm not scared. I know. Then he looked to the sky again. If I had wings, he said, I would fly to every boy who's hurting. I'd sit with him. I wouldn't say much, just sit. Florence looked at him. That's what you always did best. He stood, the wings stretched wider. Then just for a moment, he rose. Not far, not fast, just enough to feel the sky. And then he opened his eyes, back in the bed, machines around him. Florence clutching his hand, tears streaming down her face. He blinked. I thought I lost you, she whispered. He smiled weakly. I was somewhere, with you, but not here. She didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. I saw wings, he whispered. Maybe they were yours, she said. He breathed in slowly, then looked at her. Mama, if I don't wake up again, don't be sad. Don't say that. No, listen. Just promise me. Keep telling the story. For me, for every kid who can't. Florence nodded, tears thick in her throat. I promise. Thomas leaned back, exhaled, and closed his eyes. The machines were still beeping, his hand still warm. Outside, the sun was rising, the city waking, the world still turning. And in a small hospital room, a mother held her son's hand and whispered to him, not because he was gone, but because his words were still echoing inside her.